Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I appreciate the time that you guys are taking to join me for this session. Whether you are listening live or you listen to the recording later, I'm happy that you are interested in cybersecurity metrics and the Balanced Scorecard. The reason that I chose this topic, cybersecurity metrics and the Balanced Scorecard, is because a lot of people who work in cybersecurity, whether you work at an executive level or you work at an entry level, struggle with identifying the right metrics for the organization and struggle presenting those metrics, whether they're right or wrong, to the business that you're supporting. I have a business background. I have a master's in business administration. And one of the great tools that I learned to use academically while I was in school was the Balanced Scorecard. And I have found if you combine the right tools, if you combine the right processes, there is a great opportunity to gather the right information, format it properly, present it to the business, and then it's going to produce some type of meaningful outcome for your stakeholders and your constituents. As your speaker, just a little bit about me. My name is Keyaan Williams. I founded CLASS-LLC. I used to be a CISO. I was in the Army. I continue to work in ministry. Part of the work that we do as a company is related to workforce development and education. I've been a college professor. I've supported the ISSA International. The reason that all of these items are relevant are because they just provide some information about my background and my capability to lead the conversation. I am not the only expert. I've seen some of the people who registered for the event. There are a lot of people that know components of all of this. My objective in this conversation is to bring all of the ideas together under one umbrella so everybody has great tools that they can use to accomplish success or to accomplish their mission and achieve success. As we go along for the recording, if you'll post your questions in the chat, I'm happy to answer them at the end, just so that everything is smooth. Once we finish the recording, for those of you who want to stick around and continue the conversation, it was intentional that I did this as a Zoom meeting instead of a webinar. Everybody's kind of burnt out from webinars, and I thought that leaving time for a conversation at the end would be constructive. Starting with the fundamentals, definitions are always important. The students that work with me or who are in our education programs are always receiving some level of definition just to make sure that we're coming from the same perspective or coming from the same direction. Strategic planning is an interesting concept because not only is it a noun and an item that you're focusing on, but it also is an action that you're going to produce. And so from a noun perspective, the outcome of all of your efforts is going to be the strategic plan that describes where the company is going, how they're going to get there, all of the measurements and stage gates that exist along the way. And then strategic planning as an activity is the process that's going to produce all of this outcome. What's important to recognize when you talk about strategic planning is that most organizations do a very good job coming up with the plan and what they want to do. And at the same time, statistically, 90% of companies that have a strategic plan or have gone through the strategic planning process fail to execute on the plan that they came up with. And this brings into context, and as part of the conversation, the concern about the difference between planning and execution. If you have never encountered strategic planning, it is a very simple process once you understand the basics. Whether you are using organic strategic planning or you're using a defined model, for the most part, the process for coming up with a strategic plan and developing everything is going to follow 5 steps. And so I tip my hat to Eliron and their article in Forbes magazine from 2015 that says this very simply and plainly. I want to determine where I am. Very often that's going to involve some kind of assessment or analysis. If you look at more complex models or programs, I talk about SWOT analysis, where I'm evaluating my strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. But at the end of the day, my objective is to say, where are we? And that's going to help me go into phase 2, where we identify what's important. What's important is going to add context to the effort so that you know, why are we going, where we're going, where are we going, where are we trying to end up, and how do we know that we've arrived when we finally get there? Step 3 builds upon the first 2 steps, where we're just going to define what we must achieve. We're going to determine who is accountable, because accountability is very important. You want to make sure that you know who is responsible for the activities that you're performing, who ultimately owns the outcome. If we're talking in a security context, from a security perspective, the Chief Information Security Officer and the security team do not own enterprise risk. And so the CISO might contribute to developing the strategy for security and aligning that strategy with the business, but somebody else is going to be accountable for the outcome. It's going to be the CIO that you report to. It's going to be a business unit that supports your activities. Somebody else is going to ultimately be accountable for the outcome and the execution of the strategy, and then other people are going to play other parts. Again, your CISO might have some responsibilities. Some parts of the business might be consulted. The board of directors and the CEO might be informed, but establishing what are all of the responsibilities and the swim lanes in the process is going to be important, so that you know who to turn to for resources and who do you turn to blame when something has gone wrong and you haven't executed properly. The final part of the process is just to review. The idea of review is where metrics come together and why we're talking about strategy, metrics, and the balanced scorecard in one conversation. Customarily, when you're doing strategic planning for a business perspective, or for a business objective or activity, and you've completed the first 5 steps, you're going to periodically review your progress. I'm going to do reviews weekly, monthly, quarterly, annually, and continue that life cycle throughout the entire time frame that the strategic planning activity is going on. Very often, technology reduces the scope of your strategic plan to maybe 18 or 24 months. But if I have a 10-year strategy for business transformation, for digital transformation, or for some other activity, I can't just rest on the plan and hope that everything is successful. I do have to periodically check and verify the things that we plan to do are being executed properly. Do we need to make corrective actions? Are the people, processes, and technology that we allocated to support the execution effective and producing what we meant for them to produce? By doing these regular reviews throughout the entire life cycle of your execution, you have a great opportunity, again, to take corrective action, to figure out what's broken, and to fix it before you've spent millions of dollars and worked for many, many years to produce something that has no value to the organization. When we focus this and shift from a business context specifically to security, there are great opportunities to combine security risk management, just security governance, and security activities generally to the strategy that the business has established. For example, if I work for a publicly traded company and their corporate strategy is to increase their market share in a competitive marketplace, I could be doing makeup, I could be doing oil and gas, I could be a manufacturing organization. Regardless of the industry, regardless of the organization, everybody has some type of strategy that they want to accomplish. Understanding the corporate business strategy is going to be very valuable when you start to use and incorporate security into the conversation. Under ideal circumstances, if you do this right and if you do it well, everything that you do in your security strategy is going to align with what the business said that they want to do. And as a security person, whether you're an executive or you're an entry-level person or somewhere in the middle, you should be able to describe every activity that you perform for the benefit of the organization to achieve the strategy that they established. When I worked at the CDC, we had a great example of this, where the mission of the CDC is to communicate accurate and timely public health information so that people can make decisions about saving lives, disease research, and other activities. And the entire goal of the security organization at the CDC and our strategic statement was that we exist to protect the science. The CDC as a scientific organization had a very clear business objective. It was very clear for people to understand, why does security exist and why are we forcing people to fill out checklists, to do system security plans, to do compliance, to do risk management or incident response. The answer to the why question always aligned to the strategy, and the security strategy aligned to the business strategy. So there was synergy and an interlinking between what the business is trying to do and why security exists to support the business. All of that combines to provide some context about why this presentation was put together, why we're focusing on business processes and business terms in conjunction with security. There are great opportunities for security people to grow, to be successful, and to achieve the outcomes that they're looking for, whether that outcome is reducing risk or getting your budget approved or doing something else for the benefit of the organization. If you align all of your security language with the business strategy that the organization has come up with, so that everybody understands, what are you doing, why are you doing it, and what's in it for me when you're talking to business people, the board of directors, or some other type of stakeholder. If you move away from compliance, the primary focus of what you're doing when you are developing your security strategy and you start to identify your metrics should focus on risk. What is the risk that the organization is facing? What can we do about that risk? What are our treatment options? What are the impacts that are going to affect the organization? If I tip my hat to other people who came before me, there are some great people like Stephen Northcutt and others who work at SANS, who work at commercial organizations, who work at educational organizations, who have combined their knowledge to come to the conclusion that the best things that a security person can talk about related to strategy, metrics, and risk management is the operational impact, the financial impact, the programmatic impact, or the regulatory impact on the organization. As we start to think about the metrics that we're going to gather and the things that we're going to talk about when we communicate to the business, if you can't identify and communicate, why do I care about this related to our operations? Or why do I care about this related to our revenue? The business people that you're communicating with are going to lose touch. They're not going to be interested. Compliance is only going to take you so far, but if you can start to communicate and frame the conversation in other areas that the business cares about, you're going to have greater opportunities to achieve success, to get everybody on board, to get the culture of the organization to be aligned with the things that security people are taught naturally and as part of our profession. When we start getting into security, the definition of security is going to be very important. If you asked 100 people, how do you define security? Depending on their background, the business area that they work in, and the technical capabilities that they have, they're going to go into feelings, perceptions, things that are fake, things that are real, things that are measurable. And so the idea of definitions as a framework for our conversation is just as important as the idea of clearly defining within the organization, what do the terms that you're using mean, and what relevance do they have to the way that we operate? For example, for those of you that do incident response, there are many situations where the difference between an incident and a data breach and a cyber attack is going to have a different meaning to different people. In the United States, the National Conference of State Legislatures has a website dedicated to formally describing the definition of a data breach in each state and in all of the territories that make up the US. But data breach in their context has a legal connotation and has legal penalties and obligations that are associated with it that might mean something completely different when you're dealing with a corporate definition of a data breach. Some companies might describe a data breach as unauthorized access or disclosure of sensitive information. Other people might describe a data breach as just somebody accessing a file that they couldn't access. But unless everybody has the same understanding of the definitions, people are going to go in different directions, be on different pages, and not have the same understanding ultimately about the value that security is providing, the benefits that exist, and the results or outcomes that we're trying to produce with our strategic plan, as well as the communication of our metrics. If you can get this right and get everything lined up, get everybody on the same page, get everybody talking about the same thing in the same language, focused on the same problem, there is a huge opportunity to create harmony between what security is doing, what the organization is doing for risk management, and what the business strategy is that's guiding all of the activities, the resources, and the budget of the organization. You know, again, if I'm a manufacturing company and I'm cranking out widgets, which is the primary example that's used in business school, maybe I want to crank out the highest quality widget, and the highest quality widget is going to have a relationship to operational uptime, which communicates or has a relationship to security and how well we are preventing cyber attacks, data breaches, ransomware, or anything else. For those of you that are following the news, you may have seen that there are a lot of SCADA and industrial control systems attacks that are happening right now. There's also a huge increase in attacks against managed service providers. And so the risk is not limited to your organization and how you operate, but it encompasses your organization, all of the upstream systems, the downstream systems, and all of the relationships that you have that influence how do I operate, who do we depend on, what technology do we depend on, and where's the information going. And so the business strategy is going to set the direction, but you still have to do risk management properly and understand what you're facing and identify appropriate treatment options. Then you can start to apply security as an additional layer that starts focusing on controls and achieving the CIA triad of confidentiality, integrity, and availability that's focused on the critical assets and the critical information rather than trying to get confidentiality, integrity, and availability as a blanket that covers 100% of what's going on in the organization. With the foundation established as we go forward, the next area of focus is really just how do I measure my performance when I'm doing all of these things? Performance measurement for information security is the guide that we're using to facilitate this conversation. NIST and Special Publication 800-55 has a document of the same title that gives an exhaustive overview of evaluating my program, understanding the metrics that need to be created, categorizing those metrics into different areas of interest, and then documenting it and reporting it to the organization. We'll go through some of that as part of this conversation. I highly recommend looking at NIST 800-55 if metrics is part of your responsibilities. And as you will see from the examples going forward, this is a very powerful tool to help you at least organize all of the data that you have within your organization and then present it to the business in a consumable format or in a framework that everybody understands. When you look at the benefits of measures as described in NIST 800-55, there are 4 key outcomes that are going to be produced when you do this right. And your performance measures can apply to your strategic plan, to your security strategy, or to your risk management strategy. Number 1, you have increased accountability. If I'm measuring everything that happens within the organization and something is going wrong, because we're measuring everything, we know what went wrong, how bad it was, who the owner was, and what needs to be taken care of. And if people aren't doing their jobs, now instead of operating based on how I feel about things, I can operate and make decisions based on empirical evidence and real numbers that exist within the organization. Having this capability improves the effectiveness of our processes, because if our measurements demonstrate that a process is not working well or we're not achieving the desired outcome, we can take corrective action, reallocate resources, buy new tools, add people, or do something that's going to adjust the situation and improve the environment for the organization. Very often, if you're gathering metrics properly, you're reporting them in the right format, you have the right area of focus for the organization of the metrics, it is very easy to align what you're doing from a metrics and reporting perspective to your compliance obligations. For example, if I'm governed by ISO 27001 because I have an information security management system, I should be able to develop some kind of metric or measurement that highlights the performance of the security controls that I have in place, the processes, the percent of compliance with our organizational policies. There are many areas that we can develop metrics for all of those control families that are in ISO. The same concept applies to NIST, where if I'm using the NIST risk management framework, if I'm doing FedRAMP, if I'm doing CMMC, there's going to be a collection of controls that are organized around control families. Each control family has an objective, and each control family is going to use people, processes, and technology to accomplish that objective. For every one of those components, as you'll see when we go forward in the presentation, you should be able to ask interesting questions that are going to allow you to identify how do we measure how well this is working and how well we are conforming to the requirement of the goal that was established by the organization or was established by some third party, like a regulator or a partner, or in the case of PCI DSS, by having a contract that drives obligations for my company. The last item is just the idea about quantifiable input. Very often when you have the choice between qualitative measures and quantitative measures, people choose qualitative measures because it's easy and you just identify your categories as low, moderate, or high, or you do the traffic light protocol and do red, yellow, green. But when you're gathering metrics, one of the qualities of your effective metrics is that they have to be quantifiable. They should also be readily obtainable, and they should be useful for directing resources. But if I start to measure the items in percentages, in frequency, in some numeric measurement, there's going to be a greater opportunity to develop trends and to measure the change in performance over time, rather than just looking at it today and only having the context of today. To the extent possible, you want to make sure that you have every opportunity to say, where were we when we started? How have we been progressing along the continuum? And then what are the next steps or the next actions that we need to take as a result of the information that has been gathered and all of the capability that we have to respond to the findings. As I said in NIST 800-55, they have 4 categories of effective measures. If the measures are quantifiable, it's going to be in a format that allows you to count based on percentages, numerically, or by some frequency. If the data is readily obtainable, I don't have to go through extraordinary measures to gather the data. I shouldn't have to get into a rocket ship and fly to the moon as a one-time activity to gather this information, and then I call it a metric. That's really more of a survey. I'm producing interesting information, but it's not an ongoing activity where it's easy to gather the information and report it. The idea of readily obtainable relates to the idea that the measurement should be repeatable. And so I should, on a regular frequency or on a regular schedule, be able to gather the information. And then the final most important item is that the information should be useful for tracking performance and directing resources. If I cannot do one or both of those items, the information that I've gathered really is interesting information rather than something that I would define as a metric. If the information is not useful, it's not going to fit into a tool like the Balanced Scorecard that we'll talk about in a moment, or it's not going to fit or be valid and appropriate for a presentation to your leadership, to your board of directors, or to anybody who cares about the volume of security data that can be captured and presented to the organization. Another valuable artifact within NIST 800-55 is the way that they describe people should categorize the metrics that you're gathering. What I see in a lot of cases, both in my consulting work and when I was a CISO, and even in academic situations, is that people lump all the metrics together in a large blob, and they often have a hard time figuring out, how do I present this information in a way or in a format that makes sense to the business? How do I distill it down? How do I focus on what's most important? The benefit of the 800-55 is the recommendation that you focus your categories on implementation, effectiveness and efficiency, and impact. When we talk about implementation, that's going to be focused on all the measurements that you can gather that communicate how well the execution of my security policies are going. If I have a policy that says all sensitive data is going to be encrypted, I should be able to gather metrics in terms of percentages or frequency that says, do I have an inventory of 100% of my data? In all cases, is that data encrypted? What is the difference between the goal and the actual situation that exists in the organization? And now I can do something to track performance or direct resources to resolve the problem that I identified with the data that I gathered. Similarly, your effectiveness and efficiency measures measure the results of security services delivery. If I'm working with an MSSP, a lot of those security services that they're providing are going to go into the effectiveness and efficiency measures. If I'm delivering DLP or data loss prevention as a service is going to automatically provide some kind of security control, and I should be able to answer a collection of questions that identify how well is the control working, what is the efficiency and the effectiveness of the control, is it making a difference, is it changing the nature of the risk that we're facing, and is it adding value to the security posture that we're trying to establish for the organization. The final area, and the area that we'll focus on as a specific example or as a use case, is your impact area. Impact measures identify the business mission or consequence related to your security events. And so a data breach could be a security event, a ransomware could be a security event, but all of those metrics related to the event itself are going to be valuable to help you forecast what is our position in terms of preventing the event from happening, or when the event happens, what is our capability to detect it and provide remediation, or when the event happens, how long does it take me to identify that it occurred so that we can start the incident handling process. All of the other questions that can be produced out of that concern are going to help you start to identify what are the real things that we want to measure within the environment. For example, if we're focused on ransomware, because that's an important item in the news, what is the level of implementation of all of the security controls that are going to prevent ransomware? How well have we segmented the network? How well are we managing information flows for all of the things that we can do that we already know in advance are going to prevent ransomware from creating a financial and operational or regulatory impact? What is our level of performance? The answer to those questions can be answered in the metrics that you develop and the way that you measure that information over time and the way that you use that information to make decisions. Very often, the problem really is an oversight in a configuration, lack of implementation throughout the entire organization, or you just don't have enough people or technology to solve the problem. But making a transformation and shifting from the bad state to the good state is much easier if I have data to support my argument and to justify anything that I'm requesting. Another area that's valuable in the 800-55 is the table that they use to help you categorize all the information. You have in this document much more content that's on the slide, but it talks about measurement IDs, your goals, what you're measuring, the type of measurement, going back to the previous slide, the formula that you use to calculate the measurement, because we're doing everything quantitatively. What is the target? What is the objective? All of this information is going to work together for all of the metrics that you have so that you can tell a story, paint a picture, get people to understand what is the outcome that we're looking for and how far away are we from the goal, because the goal for security is aligned to the business objectives and the business strategy that has been established. When you start to put this into action, it is a relatively straightforward process once you understand all the criteria and the components. Very simply, we spent a meaningful amount of time talking about a metric, what it is, how it works, and what you're supposed to do with it. But if you boil it down to the very simple part, a metric is simply the combination of data and algorithm that you use to capture that data. I reduce it to tell a story. And so I might have 10 quadrillion attempted penetrations through the firewall. That would be interesting information. The story that we're really looking for is, out of all of the things that tried to get through, what actually got through, what was not authorized, what was the impact of these successful penetrations of our perimeter defenses. Now we're starting to boil things down and reduce it to tell a story that matters, that allows us to take that information and direct resources to invest more in our defenses, to upgrade technology, to add people to the equation. Our capability to do all of that is enhanced by the metrics that we're using. When you start to get into the details, it's hard to define a metric for some people because people are used to using pie charts or they're counting simply. They're not using any kind of real advanced mathematical processes for documenting the information and bringing it all together. One of the things that's going to help, especially when we're talking in a security context, is to think about whether or not the information that I'm gathering is communicating the value that security is adding to the organization. If we go back to the firewall example, a lot of people will talk about the value of a firewall in terms of the price, in terms of the cost savings if it was on sale, in terms of the benefit that it has to satisfy your compliance, your regulatory or your contractual obligations. But the real value is in the feature of the firewall as a technical device in your environment, how it's deployed in the environment, how it contributes to network segmentation. If you have a next generation firewall, the value in terms of your metrics that you're communicating is going to relate to VPN and creating secure connections, which reduce risk, which are going to prevent incidents from occurring. And now you can start to get increasingly granular in the description of the value of a single device by itself or a collection of firewalls or the entire ecosystem of security technology that you've deployed within the environment. If you focus on communicating that information as it relates to supporting the corporate strategy, now you have a focus for the conversation that you're having with the business, that you're having with your executive counterparts, that you're having with the board of directors, so they understand and they connect the dots. We're spending $500,000 on this infrastructure so that we can control remote access because everybody's working from home. We're going to ship small business or small office, home office routers to people's homes because everybody's working from home in the midst of a pandemic. And now we're going to measure the reduction in incidents or loss of data or unauthorized access to our environment because home users don't have the same network infrastructure that we had at the corporate environment. We identified that there was an increase in attacks and problems. We solved that problem by justifying spending $100 per user to send a pre-configured router to their homes. And now people are using a corporate-owned device that is communicating through a corporate-owned router that is connecting to a corporate-managed VPN. And now we have the justification for why we did all these things, but now we can also measure the impact. Yeah, it's a great story to say, yes, dear employees, we're going to send you an additional router that's configured and you just plug it in, and that's how you're going to connect to enterprise resources from your home office. It's another story to tell to say that by the outcome of us doing this, we have measured a reduction in risk, we have fewer incidents, we have fewer abuses, we have fewer endpoint violations for endpoints that are outside the corporate environment, and it's much more difficult to reach from the corporate environment into people's homes to update those endpoints, add software, or do something else. We have a better ecosystem for security. We have a better opportunity for risk management. It's aligned to the business strategy because we're not having outages, incidents, or interruptions. And now everybody understands because our focus was really related to the corporate strategy and the impact of a large work from home workforce that wasn't part of the plan originally. We're talking about the security value because we were able to measure the state before, we measure the state during, and then the after state under ideal circumstances is going to put you in a better position. And so I've justified my budget and the outcome. You know, as a rehash of our strategy conversation, it's important to remember that strategy is really just a high-level plan that describes how you're going to achieve a goal, and I'm going to continue to measure my performance while I'm working on the execution to ensure that I achieve what it is I set out to achieve. You know, if my plan is to go to the Appalachian Mountains and I end up in the Rocky Mountains, I should have discovered somewhere along the way that I'm going in the wrong direction, going to the wrong mountain. Your metric as an algorithm that tells a story is going to very quickly highlight that I'm going in the wrong direction. I need to stop, adjust my course, make changes in the approach that we're using so that I can get to the Appalachian Mountain that I set out to arrive at. When you put this in action, security awareness training is a good example to use for this conversation. It's the example that I used originally in the Secure World presentation because most organizations require security awareness training. It is either a compliance requirement or it is just a simple good practice because the more your users are aware of the risks they face, the better they are going to respond to those inputs. The challenge, again, when we look at the way that people normally describe the metrics for security awareness training, is simply that they'll say, what % of people completed the training? If the training window is from July 1st to July 31st, the only metric that you communicate under normal circumstances for people that do not dig deeper is that we had X% of the workforce completed the training when they were supposed to, then we're going to check the box and keep moving. If we were to dig a little deeper and we go back to the types of measures that we talked about before, there are implementation measures, there are effectiveness measures, there are impact measures that we can pull out of the question simply related to security awareness training. With implementation being focused on your security policy, if my policy says that all users are going to complete annual security awareness training, that is one area of measurement where I can focus on the percentage that people normally focus on. My effectiveness measure, because it focuses on the delivery of security services, is now going to allow me to start to develop measures and metrics for the security awareness training platform that I'm using. Am I using KnowBe4? Am I using OFISH? Am I using something else? How well is it configured? How well are people responding to it? What is the impact that it's having on the environment in terms of the way that users are more aware when you do a test, sending out the phishing campaigns and seeing who's clicking on the links, who's not clicking on the links, who's reporting incidents that they observe in the environment based on the policy that you train them on and based on the policies that exist within the organization. You know, your impact measure as a tool to measure the consequences of security events is another area where you can dig deeper than just saying the number of people that completed the training, and you start to get into what is the relationship between security awareness training and other incidents that we're observing in the environment. For example, you could do some level of correlation or causation, depending on how you frame it, to say that as a result of 95% of our employees doing security awareness training, we have reduced the number of endpoint incidents generated by a user by X%. Or you could say that as a result of none of our executives bothering to do the training because they're too busy, we had losses of $1 million because somebody in finance and accounting clicked on a business email compromise message. We had business email compromise as part of our security awareness training. The person that needed that training did not take the training. And as a result, according to the impact, we lost millions of dollars because money was wired somewhere that it shouldn't have because somebody didn't do the training. There are a lot of opportunities to combine something as simple as security awareness training to other factors, other concerns, other information that you have within the environment. So the story that you're telling, when you take the metric, you apply an algorithm, you boil it down and tell a story. That story now has more meaning to people who care or to people who can do something about it in terms of driving behavior, because the CEO is going to be interested in these things. Or if you have the opportunity to communicate to the board of directors is going to be interested in a new package for the same old information that we've been providing anyway. The better they understand the information, the better they can act on it. And as the organization is acting on good information that you're providing, they're going to be much more likely to take action, to provide resources, or to change behavior within the organization to stop the bad thing from continuing to occur. And so if we take the example of business email compromise, the greatest area of concern is going to be the impact measurement. Again, your impact measurement is focusing on the consequence related to your security policies, your posture, or the things that you put in place. And so if I were gathering all three categories of metrics and I had this very rich, interesting data set, one of the other things to consider is the audience that's receiving the information. Within an organization, when you're working in security, you're going to be talking to peers, you're going to be talking to non-technical end users, you're going to be talking to infrastructure people who also work within the organization, or you could be talking to business executives. Framing the message for the audience that you're talking to is going to be very valuable. And so if I were giving a report to the board of directors, the impact measures are the only thing that I would focus on. If I were in the role of the CISO, I would also consider the other two categories of measurement to say, hey, how are we doing with our policy enforcement? How are we doing with the delivery of security services? I'm going to take the answer to those questions and use that to formulate the story that I tell when I organize it under the impact conversation, and then succinctly present that conversation to the board of directors so that they understand the problem, they understand the justification for the recommendations that I'm making, then they approve the recommendation and we have buy-in and everybody lives happily ever after. If we go back to an earlier slide, another area of concern is focusing your impact measures on things that matter. This is going to be your financial impacts, your operational impacts, your regulatory impacts, or for some organizations, reputation is also a concern. But if you limit the organization of the content and the focus of the impacts to those four areas, you're going to have a much more focused conversation. The information is going to be much more valuable to non-technical business people that need to take everything that you're giving them, process that information, and then use it to make some kind of decision. Some organizations are going to decide to do nothing. Other organizations really don't have a lot of budget because they have small margins. You imagine a hospital that does indigent care and 50% of their, or 100% of their revenue comes from 25% of their patients, but they still have to serve the community. Now, when I'm choosing between some kind of new security technology or something that's going to increase the way that I deliver healthcare services, we have an opportunity to compare apples to apples. There is a huge impact if our systems go offline. So it doesn't matter whether or not we buy a new MRI. If the power is shut down, the SCADA systems are taken over, and ransomware shuts down our operations. That goes into the impact metrics that we want to talk about in the context of a hospital or a healthcare organization that has to balance security spending versus operational spending. When we take all of this information and apply it to a tool that the business is going to understand, your non-technical business people very often are going to resonate with a tool that's called the Balanced Scorecard. The Balanced Scorecard is the tool that I selected for this presentation. One, because I use it all the time. Two, because I learned about it academically as part of my business degree. But three, the statistic that we have on the slide highlights that more than half of the major corporations globally are using Balanced Scorecard tools and approaches. And so 50% of global organizations are using this to manage their businesses. Presenting the information about security and risk management to the business in the format of a tool that they're already using is going to increase the likelihood that they understand what you're talking about, what's in it for me, why do I care, and what do I need to do about this. As I said before, companies generally fail at implementing their strategy or managing their operations because they don't have a management system to integrate and align those two vital processes. This statement comes from one of the authors or the creators of the Balanced Scorecard, and this provides context to kind of highlight why are we talking about security, risk management, metrics, and a business tool for communicating information in one conversation. Once you get it right, once you learn how to do this, once you become effective at delivering the information in this format, you have a great opportunity to bring everything together so that the security strategy is aligned with the business strategy and people are actually achieving real results. The Balanced Scorecard has been around for more than 75 years, so it's an old tool, it's not a new tool. More than 70% of corporate executives are baby boomers, and so this is something that is going to be familiar to most of the board of directors and most of the senior executives within your organization, especially if we're talking about a traditional publicly traded company, and so it just adds value to the conversation that you're having. Within the Balanced Scorecard, the way that it works is you have 4 perspectives that frame the conversation and help you focus on the right problem. Starting from the left, the financial perspective is related to the flow of money into and out of the organization related to the area that I'm concerned about. The customer perspective is focused on our stakeholders. The learning and growth perspective relates directly to the conversation that we had about performance measurement and understanding how well are we operating and what improvements we need to make. And then your internal processes is focused on the use of people, processes, and technology within the organization to achieve the strategy that has been identified. When you combine all 4 of these perspectives together, there is a tool called a Balanced Scorecard Strategy Map or a Balanced Scorecard worksheet that provides a framework for organizing all of the information into a logical workflow. The ovals that are in the picture identify areas of concern. The perspectives that are listed can be modified and adjusted. And so in this context, working from the bottom up, my ultimate goal is to get my budget approved. And if I decompose the idea that as the CISO, I want to get my budget approved, I have to figure out a way to organize all of the perspectives in a sequence that makes sense. And so I said that we're going to take our metrics as the foundation in this model, apply that to learning and growth, and focus on what do my metrics say about the optimization of technology and the efficiency of the security services that we're delivering. Once I get all of this right, it feeds into improving internal efficiency when we look at our use of people, processes, and technology to achieve the goals of the organization. That leads into the next bubble that talks about reducing my mean time to detect and my mean time to remediate, which are often selected as the metrics or the criteria or the measurements for my security operations. And if I do security operations well, it often has a relationship to preventing organizational outages or disruptions. If I get those right, it moves me up to the customer perspective where the customer is happy. And the customer in this context is the business that I'm supporting as the CISO. They're happy because we're not having outages, we're identifying threats and vulnerabilities in the environment quickly, we're providing remediation, there's no downtime, there is no impact to our operations, to our regulatory obligations, or to our core business processes. Because of this, we have reduced costs and overhead. There is a significant cost associated with the data breach, and if I don't have a data breach, I've reduced the overall cost for the organization. Now I've increased the value of security because my process for communicating all of this highlights the specific things that security is doing to produce these outcomes that reduce unnecessary or unintended financial outlays, which is a direct relationship between the value of security and the cost savings that we're realizing. And now I can say, dear organization, give me this budget so that I can maintain the standard that we've established. And under normal circumstances, in an ideal sense, because of all of the items in the strategy map, I am going to get the organization to give me my budget. If we rearrange this and reorganized it, maybe financial concerns aren't your highest priority. If I'm reporting to the CFO as an example, and money is not a problem, then maybe the financial perspective becomes the foundation. And from the financial perspective, I'm going to build to internal process maximization. If I work in an organization that's using the Information Technology Infrastructure Library, or ITIL, there is a continual process improvement component of IT service management that could be my priority in my organization. And so then I'll set the financial perspective as the starting point. We'll set internal processes as the goal. And then everything that we build within the strategy map is going to have a relationship between the corporate strategy, what security is doing to support that strategy, and the outcome of continual process improvement with the internal process perspective from the Balanced Scorecard as my ultimate goal. And so our conclusions as we wrap up with the time that we have remaining: if we do this right, if we align all of the components and combine my knowledge of the corporate strategy with the metrics that I'm going to use to communicate my performance, I am going to be able to communicate the value that security is offering to the business. And part of that communication is going to be using a tool like the Balanced Scorecard worksheet or the strategy map or the Balanced Scorecard process to organize all of the information in a framework and in a format that is going to resonate with the business, because most business people are accustomed to this. They've used it, they've at least seen it in school, even if they found acceptable alternatives. This is going to improve my credibility, again, whether I'm an entry-level person or a senior executive in security. This is going to create meaningful impacts for the organization. And now we start to have a better relationship between security and the business, instead of security being an outlier or that ridiculous cliche of security just being a cost center and just being there to spend money to achieve compliance goals and outcomes. At this point, I'll stop the recording. I'll say thank you for participating in the conversation. And if you would like to stick around and have a discussion, I am very happy to engage in conversation for as long as anybody is interested.